The night I was cast out did not arrive with thunder or tears, only a brittle voice and a finger pointed toward the front door like a loaded weapon. My father, now known to the world as Elias Hartman, never asked if I was safe, never questioned who had got me pregnant, never paused to consider what I might need. Instead, he declared that I had disgraced the family name and would receive nothing from him ever again. He said it with the calm cruelty of a man who had rehearsed the words for weeks, waiting for the right excuse. I did not argue. I did not beg. I did not cry. I reached beneath the chair where I had hidden a small decorative box, the kind people use for cufflinks or watches, and placed it on the dining table beside his plate. Inside were copies of loan notices, altered signatures, and forged guarantees, 3 years' worth of financial traps he had laid using my identity as collateral. Then I turned, stepped into the freezing night, and disappeared without a word. The world believed I was a reckless daughter who ran away in shame, but in truth I was a witness who fled before the criminal realized his evidence could talk. 7 years later, anger had hardened into something far more dangerous: strategy. I stood alone in a glass-walled office overlooking the crowded business district, my breath fogging the window as neon reflections pulsed below like a living bloodstream. I was no longer the frightened young woman who had slept in her car and begged strangers for work. I was now 29, the founder of Meridian Vale Capital, and my specialty was buying what others were desperate to forget: distressed financial obligations, toxic debt portfolios, and collapsed ventures abandoned by their lenders. Where banks saw losses, I saw leverage. I had spent years assembling a web of acquisitions, learning how to move quietly, how to make pressure invisible, how to turn desperation into currency. On my screen glowed a spreadsheet I had built line by line over 6 months, tracking liabilities, interest schedules, and default triggers. At the very top, in blood-red figures, sat Hartman Industrial Group, the empire my father still believed was untouchable. Elias had always been a master of appearances, shaking hands and telling stories while his finances bled through invisible cracks. He had buried himself in debt through 3 oversized development projects that never attracted tenants, relying on reputation rather than revenue to keep lenders at bay. Each missed payment pushed him closer to collapse, and he mistook the tightening grip for bad timing and economic turbulence. What he never suspected was that the banks he trusted had already sold his obligations to me. I had approached the institutions quietly, offering to absorb their risk for a fraction of the balance. They accepted without hesitation, relieved to erase his name from their quarterly statements. Overnight, I became the primary creditor on nearly $500,000 in liabilities. It was not a fortune by Wall Street standards, but for a man propped up by leased luxury and unpaid contractors, it was a death sentence disguised as an opportunity. The first sign that my trap was working arrived through my legal counsel, a man I paid generously to serve as the public face of Meridian Vale. He informed me that Hartman had reached out, desperate for a restructuring deal that would delay foreclosure and preserve his reputation. I could picture him already, confident, smiling, convinced that charm could fix what numbers could not. I instructed my lawyer to offer hope, but impose urgency, emphasizing that any lifeline would expire within 2 days. Fear was essential. Hesitation would ruin everything. When I left the office that evening, I drove in silence, radio off, allowing old memories to rise like ghosts. For years, I had carried his voice in my head, the same voice that once told me I was worthless, unstable, disposable. Tonight, I was ready to replace it with the sound of his downfall. People believe I vanished because I was young and frightened, because single motherhood overwhelmed me. That is the lie Elias still tells his associates, portraying himself as a tragic patriarch abandoned by a reckless child. The truth is far uglier. When I was 18, he had named me secretary of his company, insisting it was symbolic, a resume booster. He slid stacks of paperwork across the desk and told me to sign without explanation. I trusted him. I did not know I was personally guaranteeing high-risk loans he never intended to repay. He had used my clean credit to keep his schemes alive, draining my future to protect his. When collection letters arrived, he dismissed my concerns, calling me dramatic, advising me to focus on small things. That was the moment I realized he did not see me as family, only as a resource. 3 months after leaving, I tried to rent an apartment. I was visibly pregnant, exhausted and hopeful, clutching proof of income and a deposit in cash. The agent's expression changed as she reviewed my credit report, and she told me quietly that she could not help me. I spent 2 weeks sleeping in my car, whispering promises to the child inside me that I would rebuild everything that had been stolen. Those nights taught me that identity theft is not just financial, it robs you of dignity. Elias had walked freely while I carried his shame. That was why simply seizing his company was not enough. I needed him to confess. The meeting was arranged in a private boardroom owned by one of my shell companies. A discreet camera streamed every moment to my monitor as Elias entered with a swagger that had survived decades of deception. Trailing behind him was Jonah Reed, my former partner and the father of my child, now reduced to a loyal assistant chasing relevance. They joked, belittled the process, and bragged about plans to cycle debt endlessly. Elias even mocked me, assuming I was living in obscurity somewhere, still blaming him for my failures. He had no idea that every word was being recorded, that his arrogance was documenting his own destruction. When my lawyer placed the contract in front of him, Elias barely skimmed it, eager to reach the funding amount. He hesitated for a moment, sensing danger but fear of immediate collapse outweighed caution. He signed, commanding Jonah to witness. What he had just agreed to was a confession of judgment, a commercial clause that stripped him of all legal defenses. The instant he pledged collateral he no longer owned, default became immediate. When I entered the room, his confidence disintegrated. Recognition washed the color from his face. I explained who I was, what I controlled, and how quickly everything he valued was being seized. Accounts frozen, assets reclaimed, reputation erased. Yet his final act of cruelty arrived through Jonah, who attempted to threaten me with custody manipulation. He failed. His funds were already frozen, his lawyers unpaid. His lies exposed. Elias was left empty, powerless, and silent. The man who had sold my future for his ambition had finally paid the price. I did not seek forgiveness. I had already closed that account. The silence after Elias Hartman left the room was not peaceful. It was heavy, thick, and vibrating with the echo of everything he had lost and everything I had reclaimed. I remained seated long after the security doors closed behind him, watching the city lights pulse like distant stars across the glass wall, feeling neither triumph nor regret, but something colder and steadier: finality. Revenge is often portrayed as explosive, loud, full of shouted confessions and broken furniture, but the truth is far quieter. It settles like dust after a storm, coating everything with a stillness that demands reflection. I did not feel like a victor. I felt like a survivor who had finally balanced a scale that had been tipped long before I knew how to fight. I allowed myself a single breath, a long, measured exhale, because I understood something fundamental in that moment. The girl who had once shivered in the backseat of a rusted sedan was not erased by this act. She had been carried forward, preserved inside me as proof of what I had endured. The world would never know the cost of what I had built, the sleepless nights, the whispered plans, the fear of exposure, the loneliness of walking through boardrooms where power spoke louder than morality. But I knew. And for the first time in years, that knowledge was enough. News of Hartman Industrial Group's sudden collapse spread through the financial community within hours, cloaked in the language of market corrections and unexpected liquidity failures, as if entire lives could be erased by a polite phrase. Analysts speculated, competitors circled like vultures, and former allies distanced themselves, claiming ignorance. Elias vanished from public view, his once flattering interviews replaced by silence, his social calendar emptied, his phone unanswered. I watched the headlines without satisfaction, understanding that humiliation is not a weapon, it is a consequence. What mattered was not that he fell, but that he fell under the weight of his own choices, documented, undeniable, and permanent. Meridian Vale Capital continued to grow, absorbing more portfolios, expanding quietly, never advertising its true power. To the world, I was a rising executive. To myself, I was the architect of my own restoration. Every contract I reviewed, every acquisition I approved, carried a fragment of the past within it, a reminder of why I had chosen this path. I did not destroy to feel powerful. I built so I would never be powerless again. At home, my daughter, now old enough to ask questions, noticed the way I sometimes paused when her laughter filled the room, as if I were memorizing the sound. She did not know the history, not yet. She only knew that her mother worked late, loved deeply, and protected fiercely. I wanted her to inherit something greater than wealth or status. I wanted her to inherit the certainty that she would never be owned by someone else's mistakes. I told her stories about resilience, about choosing your own name, about how courage is often quiet and slow rather than loud and brave. Watching her sleep, I often thought about the lineage of harm that ends when someone decides not to pass it forward. Elias had tried to make me part of his cycle, but I broke it. I chose to become the interruption. Sometimes, late at night, I revisited the memories I once tried to bury. The cramped car, the cold mornings, the way strangers looked through me as if I were invisible. Those moments no longer carried shame. They carried evidence. Evidence that survival is not accidental. It is deliberate. Every risk I took, every strategic decision, every careful move was born from those nights. I had learned to read people, to anticipate fear, to understand how desperation reveals truth. I did not romanticize my pain, but I honored it because it had shaped my clarity. Without it, I might have become something smaller, something easier to break. Instead, I became precise. There are those who would call my actions ruthless. They are not wrong, but they are incomplete. Ruthlessness implies absence of feeling, yet everything I did was fueled by memory, by love, by the refusal to remain a casualty. Justice is rarely gentle, especially when built from the ruins of betrayal. I did not seek to be admired. I sought to be free. Freedom, I discovered, is not the absence of fear. It is the mastery of it. It is the ability to move forward, even when the past whispers that you are still trapped. Years from now, my story may be reduced to rumors, distorted by those who prefer simple villains and heroes. But I will remember it as it truly was, a long, deliberate journey from silence to sovereignty. I was not rescued. I did not stumble into power. I claimed it piece by piece through patience and precision. And when I finally stood in that boardroom, watching a man realize the cost of his lies, I did not see revenge. I saw closure. The world will continue turning, markets will rise and fall, names will be replaced, and legacies rewritten. Yet somewhere within the quiet rhythm of ordinary days, I carry the certainty that I reclaimed more than my credit, more than my future. I reclaimed my identity. I reclaimed my voice. And no ledger, no signature, no forged promise will ever take that from me again.